You know what's terrifying? Waking up to find out your dream of owning a home just got ripped away overnight. And I'm not exaggerating. Breaking news just came out of Washington, and what we're seeing is absolutely catastrophic for American homebuyers. The administration just pulled the trigger on tariffs that tripled the cost of importing Canadian lumber in a single day. We're talking about duties that jumped from 14.5% to over 45% overnight. And the consequences, analysts are now projecting 450,000 fewer homes will be built because of this decision alone. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how this happened, who's paying the price, and why housing experts say this is pushing the American dream further out of reach for millions of families. The question everyone's asking, how did a trade dispute over timber turn into a full-blown housing crisis? And more importantly, could this have been avoided? Hit that subscribe button right now because you're going to want to catch every video I release. So here's what just happened. A proclamation got signed invoking Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, the same national security provision used for steel and aluminum tariffs before, but this time the target was timber, lumber, and derivative wood products. The effective date, just 2 weeks' notice. Let me be clear about what Section 232 actually means. This is a trade law that allows tariffs to be imposed if imported goods are deemed a threat to national security. The argument that America's domestic lumber industry had been decimated by what they called unfairly subsidized Canadian imports, and that rebuilding capacity was essential to national defense and infrastructure. Here's where the numbers get absolutely staggering. Before the new tariffs, Canadian softwood lumber entering the United States already faced anti-dumping and countervailing duties averaging 14.54%. Those were penalties imposed earlier to offset what U.S. lumber producers claimed were unfair subsidies from Canadian provincial governments. But the new Section 232 tariffs added another 10% on softwood, timber, and lumber itself, plus a 25% tariff on upholstered wooden furniture and derivative products. Do the math with me here. The combined duty rate on Canadian lumber imports now hovers around 45%. In some cases, it's even higher depending on the specific producer and product classification. And that's a tripling of tariff costs in less than 24 hours. Smash that like button right now if this is making sense to you. And it gets worse. Canada supplies approximately 74% of all softwood lumber imported into the United States. We're talking about the structural framing for roughly 1 in 4 homes built in America. British Columbia alone accounts for a massive share of that supply, and their forestry sector was already reeling from previous tariff increases. Within days of the announcement, Canadian producers began pulling back. Shipments from Canada to the U.S. dropped by approximately 25% per month, according to industry analysts. Sawmills in British Columbia reported they couldn't absorb the tariff costs. As one senior analyst put it, the economics simply don't work anymore. For many Canadian producers, you're looking at mills that were marginally profitable now facing a choice between operating at a loss or shutting down. And here's the human cost behind those statistics. Meet a young family in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who had been saving for 3 years to build their first home. They had the land, they had the construction load approved. The builder gave them an estimate of $315,000. 2 weeks later, the builder called back. New estimate, $335,000, a $20,000 increase driven almost entirely by lumber and wood product costs. This family isn't alone. According to the National Association of Home Builders, construction costs could rise between 4 and 6% industry-wide because of these tariffs. For a typical new home, that's $5,000 to $20,000 in additional costs passed directly to buyers in a housing market already struggling with affordability. Don't go anywhere because the most explosive part is coming right up. This isn't just a trade dispute anymore. It's an affordability crisis on steroids. Now, here's where it gets interesting. To understand why this matters so much, you need to understand the mechanics of how lumber moves through the American economy and why Canada became so dominant in the first place. Let's start with the basics. The United States has plenty of forests. We have timber. So why do we import 30% of our lumber consumption from Canada? The answer comes down to three factors: geography, economics, and decades of policy decisions. First, geography. Canada's boreal forests in British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec contain massive stands of softwood species like spruce, pine, and fir that are ideal for construction framing. These forests are closer to major U.S. markets in the Midwest and Northeast than many American lumber-producing regions. Transportation costs matter. A mill in British Columbia can ship lumber to Chicago faster and cheaper than a mill in Georgia. Second, economics. Here's where the controversy begins. In Canada, approximately 90% of timberland is owned by provincial governments, not private landowners. Canadian lumber companies pay stumpage fees to harvest on public land. The U.S. lumber industry has long argued these fees are artificially low, essentially government subsidies that allow Canadian producers to undercut American mills on price. Canadian officials counter that their system is simply different, not unfair, and that American producers have their own advantages, including access to cheaper capital and larger domestic markets. This debate has been going on for over 40 years. We're talking about a trade dispute that predates most viewers watching this video. There have been multiple agreements, multiple breakdowns, and multiple rounds of tariffs imposed and lifted. The Canada-U.S. softwood lumber dispute is one of the longest-running trade conflicts in modern history. Drop a comment right now telling me if you knew about this dispute before. I read every single one. The administration decided to weaponize Section 232, framing lumber imports not as an economic issue, but as a national security threat. Critics immediately pushed back. National security for 2x4s. But the legal framework of Section 232 gives enormous discretion. If the Commerce Department says it's a security issue, the courts historically defer to that determination. So 10% on softwood timber and lumber, 25% on furniture and derivative products. And the impact was immediate. Think of it like this. Imagine you run a construction company. You've got contracts signed for 10 homes this winter. Your lumber supplier calls and says prices just jumped 30% overnight because of the new tariffs. What do? You've got three options. None of them good. Option one, eat the cost and take a loss on every house. Option two, try to renegotiate with your buyers and risk losing the contracts entirely. Option three, pass the costs through and watch your buyers struggle to close financing because their appraisals won't support the higher price. But according to the National Association of Home Builders, 67% of builders offered sales incentives and 40% reported price cuts, not because materials got cheaper, but because they were desperate to move inventory before tariff costs completely priced buyers out of the market. Now, let's talk about the supply side. Canadian lumber production has been declining for years. British Columbia's softwood lumber exports fell 9.5%. Then the Section 232 tariffs hit, and shipments dropped another 25%. Data shows Canadian exports to the U.S. are now trending below 12 billion board feet annually, the lowest level in a decade, comparable to volumes from the late 80s. And here's the kicker. American lumber production isn't ramping up to fill the gap. Why? Because building a sawmill takes time and capital. We're talking about 18 to 36 months to bring new capacity online, and that requires massive upfront investment. Mill operators need confidence that tariffs will stay in place long enough to justify that investment. But tariffs are policy decisions that can be reversed by the next administration or the next trade negotiation. It's a huge risk. Stay with me because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see this completely. The result? A supply crunch with no quick fix. Analysts project prices averaging $500 to $600 per thousand board feet, with potential spikes above 600 if tariffs remain fully in effect. And it's not just new construction taking the hit. Remodeling projects, deck installations, even furniture manufacturing, all facing higher costs. The very policy designed to protect American mills is paradoxically hurting some of them by driving up costs for downstream manufacturers who use lumber as an input. This is what policy failure looks like in real time. So who's actually paying for these tariffs? Let me break it down by category because the pain is spreading across the entire economy. American workers and families. Let's start here because this is where it hurts most. The headline figure, 450,000 fewer homes built compared to baseline projections. What does that mean in practical terms? A family in Phoenix, Arizona, earning $75,000 a year could have qualified for a $280,000 new home with the tariff-driven price increase, pushing that same home to $295,000. They no longer qualify for financing. They're shut out. Multiply that across the country, and you're looking at nearly 500,000 families locked out of home ownership because of trade policy. And it's not just home buyers, renters lose too. When home ownership becomes less attainable, more people compete for rental housing. That drives up rents. It's basic supply and demand. The housing shortage that experts warned about for years, it just got worse. Subscribe immediately if you haven't already because this content doesn't exist anywhere else. Small businesses. And now let's talk about the contractors, the framers, the small-scale builders who make up the backbone of residential construction. These aren't publicly traded corporations with financial cushions to weather cost shocks. These are family-owned operations running on thin margins. Take a typical small builder in Tennessee. Pre-tariffs, they might build 8 homes a year with a net profit margin of 6 to 8%. That's tight. Now lumber costs jump 30%, but they can't raise prices proportionally because buyers are already stretched. Their margin drops to 2 or 3% if they're lucky. Some are operating at break-even or worse. Builder confidence fell to lows, directly correlated with material cost concerns. And here's the ripple effect. When builders pull back, so do the electricians, plumbers, roofers, and landscapers who depend on new construction for their livelihoods. We're talking about an entire ecosystem of small businesses feeling the squeeze. Large corporations, even the big players, aren't immune. Publicly traded home builders saw their stock prices come under pressure as analysts revise earnings projections downward. These companies have more negotiating power with suppliers and that can sometimes lock in pricing, but they can't escape the fundamental problem. When input costs rise and buyer affordability falls, margins compress. Some large builders responded by shifting to smaller floor plans or cheaper finishes to keep headline prices attractive. Others pulled back on land acquisition, betting that the market would soften. Either way, the signal to the market was clear. Tariffs are suppressing housing production. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. International partners, and then there's Canada. The Canadian forestry sector has been vocal about what they call punitive U.S. tariffs. In British Columbia, sawmill closures rose by approximately 10%, according to industry reports. Communities dependent on forestry jobs, places like Prince George, Quesnel, and Williams Lake, are facing economic hardship. Canada also announced retaliatory measures. Ottawa introduced new tariff rate quotas aimed at protecting Canada's steel and lumber industries from what they called unfair trade actions. The rhetoric on both sides escalated. Trade talks that had been progressing stalled completely. Here's what really concerns analysts. This isn't just about lumber anymore. It's about the entire trade relationship between the United States and Canada, a relationship worth over $700 billion in annual bilateral trade. When you start throwing around Section 232 tariffs and retaliation threats, you risk unraveling trade frameworks that took decades to build. And the human cost, Canadian forestry workers facing layoffs, American families unable to afford homes, small builders going out of business, all because two governments couldn't figure out how to manage a dispute that has been simmering for 40 years. Now let's talk about what the experts are saying, because the analysis from trade economists, housing policy specialists, and legal experts is almost uniformly critical. Legal analysts have weighed in on the broader implications of using emergency economic powers for trade policy. The pattern is clear. The repeated invocation of national security justifications for what are fundamentally economic disputes. When you stretch the definition of national security to cover lumber and furniture, you're not strengthening America's position. You're undermining the credibility of genuine security measures. That credibility question matters. Legal experts note that Section 232 was designed for genuine security threats, situations where import dependence could compromise defense readiness. Applying it to softwood lumber sets a precedent that other countries will notice and potentially exploit. Comment below and tell me your thoughts on this, because I'm genuinely curious about your perspective. Trade economists have been even more direct. Analysis suggests that tariffs rarely achieve their stated goals of reshoring production, especially in industries with long investment cycles like lumber milling. Instead, tariffs tend to create deadweight losses, economic value that simply disappears as markets become less efficient. Housing policy analysts put it even more bluntly. Reports titled about how tariffs could result in 450,000 fewer new homes have been released. The analysis walks through the mechanisms. Higher construction costs lead to higher home prices, which reduces buyer affordability, which suppresses demand, which causes builders to pull back production. It's a downward spiral. But here's what really concerns analysts: the political reactions on Capitol Hill. The response has been mixed and largely partisan. Republican supporters argue that tariffs are necessary, a tough love to force Canada to negotiate fairly on timber subsidies. One senator from Wyoming, representing a state with significant timber interests, said for too long, Canadian lumber subsidies have undercut American mills. These tariffs level the playing field. Democrats have been more critical. Leadership called the policy short-sighted and warned it would drive up housing costs for working families already struggling with affordability. One representative went further, stating the administration is taxing American homebuyers to score political points on trade. This is terrible policy. And the public consumer sentiment around housing hit new lows. An analysis highlighted a shortfall of 4.7 million homes nationwide, a deficit that was already pushing prices higher even before tariffs entered the picture. Adding tariff costs on top of an existing supply shortage is, as one housing economist put it, pouring gasoline on a fire. If this is blowing your mind, hit that like button immediately. Looking ahead, the short-term effects are already visible. Lumber prices remain elevated. Housing starts are projected to stay suppressed. Forecasts show housing production will decline by 3 to 5% compared to baseline expectations. Medium term, it depends entirely on policy decisions. If tariffs remain in place, expect continued supply constraints, higher prices, and reduced home building. If trade negotiations produce a breakthrough, markets could stabilize relatively quickly. But trust between the U.S. and Canada has been damaged, and rebuilding that takes time. So let's recap the three most critical points. 1, tariffs jumped from 14.5% to over 45%, creating an immediate supply shock. 2, the direct result is 450,000 fewer homes projected to be built, deepening America's housing affordability crisis. 3, this isn't just hurting Canada, it's hurting American families, small builders, and the entire construction ecosystem. The key takeaway: Trade policy has real consequences for everyday Americans. When tariffs raise the cost of building materials, working families pay the price. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this. What do you think happens next? Will this administration reverse course or double down? Let me know in the comments. If you want to stay informed on stories the mainstream media won't fully cover, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next breakdown. Here's the hard truth. Housing policy is economic policy, and trade policy is housing policy. When you forget that, American families lose. Pause for 1 second and hit that like button. If you're getting value from this,